Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Nick Zulovich, part of the team at Cherokee Media Group and senior editor of AutoFin Journal and Subprime Auto Finance News. In today's webinar, Remaining Compliant in 2022, Takeaways for Enhancing Consumer Compliance, we're going to learn more from Ann Holtzman and Peter Krall from Allied Solutions. But before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping items for today's webinar. We are recording today's session and we'll make the recording available to you as soon as possible. So watch your inbox for a message containing a link to that recording. You will be in listen-only mode for our webinar, but we will reserve some time after the presentation for a Q&A segment. You can submit your questions at any time through the chat function here on the Zoom platform. And if we aren't able to get to your question, we'll forward it on to the team at Allied Solutions so they can respond back to you directly. So with plenty of knowledge and recommendations to share, let's get right to Ann and Peter for our webinar. Ann, Peter, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Nick. And Peter, thanks for joining me today. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk with our fellow patrons of the Cherokee Media Group. And Nick, thank you for your continued support in hosting these informational webinars. I'd like to take a minute and go over our agenda. So I'm Ann Holtzman, Senior Vice President of Risk Management and Recovery Services at Allied Solutions. And joining me today is our Vice President of National Market Group, Peter Krall. Peter is also an expert and subject matter expert in all things related to product refund liability. We'll go through our introductions as we've just done, talk about the current conditions, discuss what exactly is product refund liability. We'll review some of the regulations that are already in place, as well as some of the emerging regulations and other litigation that we see on this subject. Talk a little bit about product strategy and technology. So again, thank you all for joining us. And Peter, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks so much, Ann. Looking forward to our discussion today.
Wanted to take an opportunity to talk a little bit about what we're seeing and hearing out there in the current conditions of the marketplace. So one, of course, is the demand for used cars at this point in time, with limited new cars out there. There's, of course, an increased demand for used vehicles, and we're seeing inflated used car prices. Approximately 15 to 20% of repo agent shops were unable to survive this extended period of lower delinquencies, and thus the lack of repossessions along with those lower level delinquencies have really made it difficult for repo agents to remain in business. We are seeing low levels of delinquency, which in turn increases the number of new car or used car loans that are paying off early. Because if you look at accumulated savings, we're at an all-time high, record high of accumulated savings going into 2022. We've also seen a large focus on the change in regulatory environment, enhanced audits and business reviews, a lot of supervisory highlights and areas of highlight that are coming out from the CFPB, and of course, changing regulations related to UDAP and other types of regulations such as Reg F, and continued activity out of Washington, D.C. Of course, those regulatory reviews are also focused on things like all-in APRs, and now highlighting things such as overdraft fees. So we're seeing a lot of uncertainty in the market, a lot of scrutiny in the market, which is causing lenders and service providers to really ensure that they are focused on practices and processes that have a high level of consumer sensitivity. Next slide, Peter. So we believe that delinquencies and repossessions will remain static over the next 12 months. Although we're seeing a slight increase in delinquency, it is not in any way a increase that is causing us to sit up and take notice. So again, thinking that these will remain static. Used car values, if you talk to those in the industry, they're not really expected to decline until later this year. So deficiency balances and situations where folks can make early payoff to loans is expected to continue in 2022 into 2023. And in addition, new car supply that are now going onto lots are the most basic of units and have market adjustments upward to several $1,000s. And that, of course, when the used car prices decline, will pose a threat to things like GAP and other ancillary products following 2022. We've already spoken a little bit about our repossession partner impacts. We're also experiencing in certain parts of the country issues with transport and high fuel fees. So I caution everyone who now has lower level delinquency, haven't had to put a lot of repossession assignments out there, to understand the challenges that the repossession agents are facing. Issues with transport, issues with staffing, issues with compressed fees, and issue with higher expenses. So it does appear when those delinquencies uptick that there's going to be market pressure on resources in the area of repo agents. Thus, the use of technology and other solutions probably want to be secured at this point in time. We talked a little bit about regulations and increased scrutiny, and one of the areas that we're going to talk about today has been a topic for the CFPB in at least 2 supervisory highlights, and that is the need for consumers to receive full refunds, basically tied to GAP, but also tied to other ancillary products when they pay their loan off early or they experience a total loss or repossession. So we're also seeing debt collection rules and practices, as well as overdraft fees, collection bans, all types of different regulation and proposed federal and state mandates coming out around things related to debt collection. And of course, when you think about ancillary product refunds, you also think about those things that happen during the collection process, such as impounds, abandons, and repossessions. And then finally, as we look back to Used Car Week and many of the panels and the information that we heard from top of mind from many of our financial institution partners and service partners and vendor partners, a real focus on company cultures, mental health, back to work models, and a balance between personal and professional safety and the performance of our organizations, along with, quite honestly, difficulty in securing and having a raid on talent and human resources. So a lot of different challenges that we're facing, but knowing this industry, I'm sure that we will all be poised well to attack those challenges. Turning now to one of the hot topics out there in relation to regulation as well as class action litigation is the whole topic around product refund liability. So if you kind of think about, or in the back of your mind, think about 2 numbers, 50 and 60, it kind of sets the table for what Peter's going to share with you later on in this webinar. More than 50% of loans are paid off early. And with that payoff, if there is an ancillary product and in many of the regulations pointed directly at GAAP, there is an obligation to ensure that that refund makes it back to the consumer, whether that vehicle is traded in or sold or paid off early. 60% of those loans have a vehicle or loan protection product on them. So 50% paid off early, 60% of those 50% have an ancillary product or loan protection product that requires refunding. So what is product refund liability? I'm sure that a majority of you that are listening into this webinar are well aware of what that is, but it's simply the financial liability that's owed by a lender, dealer, or administrator to a member or borrower for the refundable portion of a contract or product coverage at the time of the auto loan. We also talk to or refer to those as VPP, or voluntary protection products. This liability is created by key events. We also refer to them as triggering events, such as early loan payoff, collections, repossessions, and total loss. So in all of those instances, those triggering events, there is an obligation to ensure that the consumers receive the refund benefit or the benefit of claim coverage in the case of GAAP, that affect that loan and the deficiency balance on that loan, as well as additional consumer benefit from an early payoff of an automobile loan. Examples of ancillary products or voluntary protection products that we're talking about today, the most regulated and where we have the most regulatory activity is around GAAP, guaranteed asset protection, credit life insurance, involuntary unemployment, disability, credit property, AD&D. But again, that's a smaller impact product for cancellation as compared to GAAP. And then of course, vehicle service contracts, extended warranty, tire, wheel, mechanical breakdown. In a case of a total loss, a refund of the pro rata share of that coverage needs to be returned to the consumer. So product refund liability is simply that liability owed to a consumer that is a result of those triggering events for ancillary products that are added to that auto loan at the time in which the loan is made to the consumer, or added to the loan afterward via some sort of close call or product add. And I know many of us have gotten the phone calls for those mechanical breakdown protection policies, but it's the refunding liability that you have as a lender or service provider to a consumer. So there is a direct to consumer impact related to product refund liability. What is interesting about this state map is the color coding of the states. So back approximately 4 years ago, when Allied Solutions partnered with one of our key financial partners and financial institutions to look at this type of solution, there were approximately 14 states that had regulation tied to GAAP cancellation requirements and GAAP waivers in cases of early payoff. All 50 states under UDAP require that you cancel and refund each and every product and ensure that that deficiency balance has all credit due to it. But the early pay states were restricted to 14. If we look at it today and the map that's in front of you, both your orange and blue color-coded states, you will see there's been a lot of regulatory activity in less than 48 months. In addition to that, there are now class action lawsuits and pending litigation in California, Colorado, Illinois, and New York. And if you happen to know, New York and California, neither one have a regulation on the book required to speak to the duties of a lender in the case of an early GAAP payoff. But there's class action litigation now pending in both states in regard to the obligation of a lender or financer to ensure the consumer gets an accurate and timely refund. So Peter, you as our subject matter expert have been entrenched in the world of product refund liability now for, well, I think we've been joined at the hip a little more than 24 to probably 30 months here in discussing this particular product in the marketplace. And you have a lot of, I think, good advice for our webinar listeners today around how we can enhance or improve consumer compliance going into next year. So I'll turn this over to you.
Oh, thank you, Ann. And it's never long enough, right? In terms of how long we've been trying to stay ahead of this curve in the marketplace. And you said it best. And you know, the simple approach we're taking is, regardless of what those colors look like on the great map that you overviewed, regardless really of what's happening with some pending legislative concerns, or regardless of even what happens with some of these pending litigations that are out there, it boils down to what we're saying on this slide here, and do the right thing, right? Product refunds, they're being called into question for liability, timeliness, accuracy. And unfortunately, you know, lenders, servicers of these auto loan portfolios are the ones that are being put into the crosshairs by both the plaintiff bars as well as the regulators, Ann. And it's amazing when you think of what you said, Ann, relative to the last few years. We've been engineering solutions, gathering marketplace feedback, talking to our constituents, working with the great folks at Cherokee Media, et cetera, of how many different solves there are for this issue for the consumers, you know, and what the lenders can do to effectuate those on behalf of the consumers, and certainly on behalf of their dealer partners and the administrators that the dealers are selling. And, you know, again, when you had referenced, and, you know, one of the things earlier relative to the CFPB, you know, twice now in the last couple of years, they've been very clear on the need to strip off those products prior to a collections event. So in a repossession, after redemption, before that vehicle is auctioned, yeah, you know, you move something into a second or third party collections on the dollar amount remaining on that loan balance, and you better be darn sure that amount that you're trying to collect has all of these products stripped off. Otherwise, that's a clear UDAP violation in the eyes of the CFPB, the unfair, deceptive, abusive acts and practices. And you can understand why. It's not money that essentially the consumer owes at that point in time, and that vehicle needs to be moved on. Now, in just this past summer, their supervisory highlights started to talk a little bit about payoff quotes, even when it just comes to a consumer requesting a payoff quote from a lender. And they started to look into a little bit more if there are optional ancillary products inside of that loan, and you as a lender are rendering a payoff quote, are you taking into consideration the refundability of those products? And specifically, they were looking at, you know, somebody just offering up a pro rata calculation on the refund. And even with that, they were peeling back the onion layers, and to say, look, the pro rata calculation may or may not be the accurate or the filed and approved refunding methodology used for that optional ancillary product. So when you render a payoff quote, you better make darn sure that you are reflecting exactly what that payoff quote should be. Now, in the eyes of the industry, and again, with these great partnerships we have with Cherokee Media and others, you still have to satisfy the debt obligation prior to issuing a refund. And one could even argue, yes, the consumer can request a refund on these products at any point in that loan. But really what the CFPB was getting at with their evolving evolution of the definition of UDAP is, hey, you know, when a payoff quote occurs, I think the spirit of what they were getting at was just simply saying this: do the right thing. Let the consumer know that there may be eligible refunds that can affect the actual amount owed. You still got to make good on that payment, that debt obligation, no question about it. But there's quite a difference, right? If you owe $22,500 on your loan, your auto loan, your retail installment contract, I should say, but you knew you were getting a $500 gap refund, and then you only owe 22,000 versus 22,500. So anyway, a lot going on. I think it can be summed up and to our conversation earlier, just on doing the right thing for the consumer, for all the parties involved, and making sure that you're not losing sight of this daunting thing called, risk, right? And the different ways to reduce that risk. We put a few things here on the slide really relative to how to reduce risk in this space, because this is being scrutinized. If you take nothing else away from this presentation, know that there have been more lawsuits issued around this issue in the last 2 years, I'll even say about 18 months, than any other when it comes to just gap on early loan pays, as Ann said earlier. And what we've thrown up on this slide here does sometimes feel like we're throwing the stuff up literally, because this reduction in risk and different ways in which automobile loan servicers and lenders need to be looking at this is continuing to accelerate. You want to reduce that risk by controlling those amounts owed for refunding, covering deficiency balances, accurately define a payoff or deficiency balance amount for yourself. We continually hear about this in terms of compliance, legal, regulatory. Have a system of record, document the way in which you are handling these. Now, when you think about that, this actually gets into, again, what color is your state? What are the state guidelines? And when you think about it, it maybe shouldn't really matter, right? Like if you document a consistent pattern of what I would call doing the right thing, regardless of state law, helping a consumer understand there may be a refund owed, the steps they need to take to obtain it, the time frames in which they need to obtain it, and you consistently manage that, as many of you are on the phone on a multi-state footprint, that can help reduce that risk. And the rest of the things kind of fall part and parcel. Expediting the refund recovery, validating receipt of funds, improving that audit trail. I mean, that's kind of self-evident, but a system of record is going to help you do that, so that not if, but when you are examined and this comes up, you have a process in place to address it. You're reducing the delays and errors, and incumbent within that is the consumer confusion, right? That's where the litigation is coming from. You're avoiding complicated carrier requirements, because again, some carriers are going to have different refunding methodologies baked into the filing of that optional ancillary product sold by the dealers. And very importantly, the reputational protection that comes along with doing the right thing and reducing your risk. It's complex. There's no question about it. Ann and I were talking earlier, and how much has changed. And as you pointed out, in 48 months, right? 24 months in those states. Well, now, and you made this point earlier, and I just think it bears repeating when it comes to the complexity and the compliance of all of these states and how they vary this level of responsibility. The lawsuit that's recently been filed in the state of New York, and it actually covers New York and Pennsylvania for an institution's footprint. Really, those are states that do not mandate that the lender do anything when it comes to a refund. And certainly when you read the gap waiver contracts that dealers are selling, again, subject to refundability, the language, I could say it's maybe not always abundantly clear, but thanks to the efforts of the industry and the Gap Model Waiver Act and other things, plain simple language is at the heart of all of these regulations. But the point behind this complexity is some of these lawsuits now are being filed not where, you said it best, Ann, in a state that mandates what a lender needs to do, but rather they are citing unfair, deceptive, abusive acts and practices. For the laws that they're citing in those states, they're looking at unfair trade practices, general business law, and other things that have nothing to do specifically with the refund of gap on an early loan pay. So again, kind of when there's, you start shadowing all of this complexity and compliance and trying to stay in front of it or shed some light on it, so there's less shadowing. What we're finding is it ain't going away, and you could actually say it's becoming more confusing relative to the ways in which some of these lawsuits are manifesting, some of the ways in which they are settling regardless of state law, and the impact that's having on lenders today and auto loan servicers. And certainly there is, and this last bullet point says it, those violations pose an additional threat, risk, and certainly some bad PR that's associated with not being able to make this as easy and as friendly for the consumer as possible. So,
Peter, as we think through this a little bit, you have a situation as well where, you have some challenging times for dealers today, automobile dealers, whether that's inventory, what demand, everything that they're dealing with in regard to vehicle shortages, having to finance with many of our lender partners, MSRPs much higher than we would have anticipated. Then you look at a remote work environment for many service providers in this space, and there's 1,000+ service providers in this space. And now all the communication that has to go on between consumer, dealer, financer, basically with systems that were not built for a remote work environment. So what you're seeing is a lot of increased pressure to ensure, as a lending institution, you provide those refunds to the consumer, whether or not you have received the refund from the dealer or the service provider. And then how do you, as a lender who are advocating for your consumers, make sure that you're leveraging the most efficient system possible? Because that efficiency of system is what will kind of get you queued up in line for the priority of the refund. And I think that's something that a number of us in the industry have really been working on, is how do we make this a more expedient process, pairing human capital, FTEs, with technology? Because as more and more vehicle supply comes out, as there's more and more regulatory activity, there's going to be more and more pressures on dealers to spend more FTEs space on this process, which they're not really built to do today. So I think it's just a great lead in to your topics here on technology, and the fact that simple technology doesn't get it done, and in some ways people aren't going to get it done in the future. There's a need to marry both.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I couldn't have said it better. I love that kind of discourse, Ann, because if you just have the technology and not the people, you barely have half of the equation. Whether you're talking dashboard reports, whether you're talking about where this data resides, I always like to say, you got to put the human in front of the IT. And that's how you really, when you take a human and you put it in front of IT, you get a really good hit. And that's marrying up the power of the intellect behind the technology that's available. And you raise an incredibly good point on the remote environment. Many lenders are going to be well into next year. We've seen different reports coming out where some are going to be returning to the office earlier. You highlighted this on your earlier slide, and now some delays are occurring. And I think in the great state of Michigan, I think some larger auto lenders are pushing that back. And it's amazing, right? What you also said, I think really, really, really should hit home. And that is, these are refundable dollars that the lender is not necessarily holding, right? Mm-hmm. These are products sold by dealers, where the dealers are holding on to a portion and that administrator is holding on to a portion. And that coordination, you can put some nice rubber bands around technologies and APIs to make it snap. But when you're really starting to look at the nuance of, hey, what refunding methodology did this product provider use in their filing in the state of Michigan or the state of Indiana? Did it contemplate cancellation fees? Is that allowable by state law? Yes or no? And then you would raise the point, what happens if there is a break in that technology or something happens where that refund is not able to be issued in a timely fashion? Well, again, you said it best, Ann. That falls right back to the lender's lap. They got to take care of that. But you have to be able to have the people behind the technology working on your behalf in order to make sure that that's effectuated in a timely and accurate fashion. And then what happens when it doesn't, when the technology fails, or there is just a delay because somebody called in sick that day and they've already been 2 weeks behind on getting some refunds issued and they're coming up on month end at the dealership. Having that auditable trail of a good faith effort by a lender to obtain and effectuate those refunds is so absolutely critical. And I'll say again, to your point, Ann, technology alone doesn't do it for you. You got to have the people who are used to doing this. It's a complement. And heck, even in our world today, you dial into your VPN if you're a lender and your bandwidth goes down to less than 10 bits per second, it's hard. It might be really hard for a lender to pull up something from their own imaging system that they haven't had to capture before, because again, those dollars are being held by somebody else, and be on the hook for that refund creates an enormous amount of challenge. So sorry to get a little long-winded there, Ann, but I think that the point you make bears repeating and emphasis.
And I think too, overall enhancing that consumer experience, which leads to borrower retention, especially if you're dealing with a trade-in, for example. And then lastly, Peter, I wanted to touch on another point, and that is, in today's environment, what a regulator needs to see is a clear, delineated, chronological set of activities from the triggering event to financial dollars credited back to consumer. And not only the timeliness of that, but the accuracy of it. And today, that's one of the things that I think is the toughest. If you're not using technology or some sort of quick quote product, or you don't understand the calculation that may be done by a service provider, that is where the breakdown is. And there's so many disparate systems that putting that all in one place where it is clear from the beginning to the end, and I love the dollar sign underneath there, Peter, where you can see triggering event to financial dollars in consumer's account or credited to consumer's account, and that those dollars are both timely and accurate. That's basically what's being asked of the industry today. And the disparate systems without the linkage of people that kind of have to make up for some of it right now, because this was not anticipated to be this much of an issue or a burden probably 36 months ago, 48 months ago, is something that's going to be critical as we move forward from into 2022. I don't see this. I see the gas pedal or the throttle moving up, not slowing down.
You got it. And you raised another great point, particularly with the word choice you had there, Ann, for disparate systems, right? Again, lenders may or may not have been capturing all of the elements they needed to effectuate these refunds because of the multiple parties involved. But the word, disparate is also one that bristles the feathers when it comes to the industry relative to originations and disparate, income, and like, okay, you've got different types of scenarios with credit scoring, where there are different interest rates and other things. The same applies exactly to what you're saying with those little arrows we drew on the screen there. Imagine that upon examination, again, to your point, Ann, what if you were refunding in this state because there's some state statutes that put the responsibility for the lender to automatically initiate a refund? And again, what does that even mean? Initiate, I sent the letter. Okay, is an initiation good enough? Does the consumer actually get their refund? Well, I initiated it. Well, I think there's a little bit more to that spirit of the law. It's like, no, you got to make sure that the consumer got those dollars like we draw on the screen, and that they are in fact accurate. I like to say it this way too, you know, a product refund divided in terms of who's doing it, you send a letter and you consider your responsibilities done, does not mean a product refund has been provided. You know, and it's that careful articulation between technology and people to enhance that consumer experience that needs to be orchestrated on every level. And you're right on, Ann, in saying that, you know, when you're looking at this from the perspective of different systems and different parties holding dollars, administrators, dealers, lender on some level, interest rates compounded, et cetera, and then you get to something as crazy as the filing for that product, this gap product in this particular state was filed and approved, and it actually had two, not one, but two refunding methodologies filed and approved in the state. Which one do you use and which one is correct? Well, the answer, of course, is either one will work because that's what's been filed and approved in the state. And either amount is in compliance for the money owed to that consumer. So how does technology account for that? It's to what you were saying, Ann. It's all about the equation that's balanced by human interaction and understanding the implications of what that means for being able to process that refund, even when you have the complexity of multiple refunding methodologies filed and approved on a carrier's paper within the states that allow them to do that. So you got it, Ann. I think we got a nice little question here for our audience. Who manages your early loan payoff product refunds today? And Ann, I know as answers kind of trickle in there from our wonderful host, Nick, you know, you can speak too, Ann. We've seen this kind of answers kind of range across the board on this one, haven't we?
Yeah, I think we had, Peter. I mean, from in-house resources to in-house resources plus a technology platform. We've seen full outsource solutions being used by some of our lender partners, and kind of a culmination of both. You know, maybe outsourcing in states where you have strong requirements to, you know, states where you have more lenient requirements. You may only be doing it in the collections area. So we've seen it kind of all over the board, Peter. I agree with you.
Mm-hmm. Even to the point where, as we've seen some things chatted into, no one, right? Like no one manages this. There, you know, and you know, maybe we could look back in time, Ann, too, and say, well, prior to gap refunds getting all of these lawsuits baked around them, we didn't really have to do this. And that, I'll say, you know, maybe there's some truth in that we do what's required, not what we have to do in terms of what's the best thing to do in every situation for the consumer. Now you have to manage a business, you have to manage your risk. And when you can clearly state that, yeah, the state law says upon consumer request, and you as a lender let your consumers even know that they may be eligible for a potential refund, and to direct them accordingly, you know, to their dealer, to the administrator, to their certificate, their waiver, read it, and it'll tell you exactly how you can request a refund. There is sufficiency in that task. There is still, I would still say there's time even to find that. And back to the state map again, you know, define the difference between automatically initiating a refund versus seeing it through to its conclusion versus, oh, it's the consumer's responsibility to do this. Well, we're not necessarily seeing a correlation when you look at the litigation that's following as a result of the complexity of those laws. So this is an interesting, you know, kind of transition to and relative to historically, right? We're talking about how we're doing a little look back here at these rules and how they've changed and some of the lawsuits that have percolated as of late. Sometimes they've been caffeinated, sometimes they're more of a decaf variety. But would you mind, Ann, just kind of walking through a little bit in terms of, you know, when it gets to this historical process, the way that the industry is changing, how these refunds are in fact being issued today, and how to optimize those from the way it's been done to kind of what what we're seeing in the industry today?
Absolutely, Peter. So if you look at it historically, it's been either from lender or consumer to dealer, dealer to the ancillary product provider, ancillary product provider back to dealer, and then dealer potentially to consumer. So it's been one of these relatively complex processes where you have a significant number of handoffs, and you are basically relying on a dealer to move the process from an event that you have as a lender to the request, and then through the process to the consumer. When you look at an optimized refund process, it is to go from triggering event to direct to provider with notification to the dealer. So at the same time that you are notifying the dealer that there is a refund that's being requested directly of the provider, because what you have to remember, it is the provider's paper that the service contract is written on, and it is the provider's calculation based on the coverage or benefit that they're providing. So they're the best ones to be in a position to be notified, because upon that notification, you are putting that provider on notice of the need to trigger that refund. You then have the provider amount, you have an equal communication to the dealer, so the dealer can be aware of the refunds that are coming to them. And then you get a, what I will call a rectified remittance between provider and dealer that can go directly to lender, and then from the lender directly to the consumer. So you can see the process from the accuracy of the refund being provided by the actual service provider, notifying the dealer then adding that portion of the refund that they owe, that combined refund reaching the lender, and then the lender directly to the consumer. And as we said before, you go from triggering event to consumer with a clear line of sight, once again enforcing timeliness and accuracy in the process with fewer handoffs, which is always key, and especially now today when many of us are working from remote environments.
There's a lot there. And I mean, it really does, I think, to your point, Ann, and that infographic that we just shared, it's exactly what this word says, planful. You know, it's a mindful, planful approach to managing those ancillary products, you know, in terms of, you know, looking at your gap allowance fees, looking at your other requirements you have as a lender for how much you want to lend, MSRP, LTVs, where you're going, you know, and being reactive in all of those compliance, transparency, automation, you know, that opens that door for that continued regulatory scrutiny or even breach of compliance, without having that planful, mindful approach to how you're managing these products. You know, another point too, Ann, we talk a lot about is that strategy, a planful strategy puts the management of those ancillary products in the hands of financial institutions to track and monitor. You know, we've seen some states where there's been some legislative pushback on behalf of lenders and dealers, where the lenders are saying, hey, dealers, this is really your responsibility, it's not ours. And, you know, that kind of, depending on the chambers, depending on the House, some of those considerations make it to a discussion on the House floor. Sometimes they don't even make it to a discussion. Now, when you look at our industry partners, the NADA, IADA, they've been very proactive in some great publications relative to the treatment of these VPPs, the voluntary protection products, and wanting to be good partners to the lenders and servicers to do the right thing. So I think that, you know, not only from the way an NADA and IADA, others are looking at it in conjunction to the industry as a whole, that product refund strategy needs to be, you know, defined a little bit further relative to the lenders in partnership with their dealers. And Ann, you said it best too, with consideration to the administrators that the dealers are selling to, but that careful coordination between all of those parties, ultimately, still today, the headlines today are falling on the lenders in terms of the responsibility as being that initiator, I'll call it the conductor of the orchestra, and notifying those appropriate parties in order to stay on top of this. It's interesting too, Ann, because we're coming up on the next question we have for the audience, which we'll jump to here on this slide, which does read for those that are in listen only. On a scale of 1 to 5, how confident are you in your product refund liability process? Nick, thanks for getting the poll up there. And as things start to come in, and I mean, again, we have seen this kind of move a lot over the last 18 months. And even as we've unpacked a lot in today's presentation relative to the incumbent responsibility, I just don't see things changing in the next few years relative to what I would call this issue taking a back seat. And I know we've talked to hundreds of lenders all over the country. Again, thank you, Cherokee Media, for a wonderful event at Used Car Week. I had some great roundtable discussions. We had some great time in the exhibit hall, and just an agenda that was really conducive to good lender to lender discussions. And even here, as we're seeing some of the answers come in, and varying from 3s, we've got some 5s coming in terms of this accountability with our lender partners in terms of that responsibility. But anything you would want to comment on, and relative to the industry, and making, in a sense, in a weird way, we're forcing ourselves to have to become more diligent around these product refund liabilities.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add there, Peter, is I think that when today, when you've got the values of used cars where we have them, you're in a more positive position related to deficiency balance. Probably one of the strongest positions related to deficiency balance that I've seen in the 25 years plus that I've been in this industry. I think there's going to be significant pressure, though, when the used car values fall, which, right now they're so overinflated that, the fall is probably going to be much more marked when it happens. And then the deficiency balance situation flips. And when that happens, and there are larger deficiency balances because the new loans being taken out today are somewhat inflated, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on service providers, gap service providers, and dealers around ensuring that every single dollar that can be recovered is recovered related to deficiency balances. Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing is the coordination of gap benefits is going to be much more critical because of these deficiency balances. So making sure you're not canceling the gap product when you actually may need that borrower or consumer to use it. So I think we're in a good, when you look at deficiency balances right now, we're all kind of a little bit in a happy place. I don't know that in 2023, we're all going to be in a happy place, which is going to put a lot more pressure on this process.
Mm-hmm. Great point. Yeah, I mean, that really brings us, I think, and to, what you've ramped us up for here in terms of really, hopefully some of these have been self-evident through the course of our dialogue and discussion and presentation today, but the best practices, right? And I want to re-echo what you said there, Ann, relative to a question we had gotten from a lender, and that was when a repossession occurs, and upon remarketing post-redemption, there is no deficiency balance. In fact, there's money owed back to the consumer. Do we still need to strip off the optional ancillary products? And obviously the answer to that is yes, absolutely. Doesn't matter if there's a positive or a negative there, a deficiency or a check going back to the consumer for the proceeds. And one of the themes too we heard, Ann, relative to our time together at Used Car Week was a lot of lenders said this. They want to do everything they can to keep their consumers in that car.
Right.
What does that mean for repos in the next year ahead? I think you've addressed that, Ann. But and even when if you don't want to get into the credit dings, hearing from some lenders that they would direct a consumer to Carvana or take their car to a dealership, see what it's worth to help them if they're suddenly becoming deficient in their ability to make the payments. So, yeah, I mean, those are a lot of unique traits to this specific period in time. And I think, it kind of helps again segue into the overall management of that auto loan portfolio and some of the best practices we have here as we get ready to close.
Yeah, so Peter, thank you so much. It's been absolutely great to do this webinar with you today. Again, I think we've probably reiterated these, so I won't repeat them to our audience, but just know that we do have some industry and regulatory white papers that, I know Nick has our contact information. We're happy to share those with interested lenders or servicers. And again, Peter, just a great job today. And thank you for your subject matter expertise in this area. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you, Ann. It was a pleasure. And as we kind of close the year here, we want to wish everybody a happy holiday season. Be safe, be well. And, most importantly, Nick, I know we were talking a little bit here as we get ready to close too. If you can, take a little time, right? Reflect on the year that we've had. Look forward to that next year in ways that we can get after a multitude of solutions for this industry. But don't forget to take a little time, hug those near to you, and enjoy the upcoming holiday season. Nick, we'll turn it back to you.
Very, very well said. Ann Holtzman, Peter Kroll, excellent presentation on so much great information and recommendations that you've each shared. And thank you again for the kind words about Used Car Week. It was certainly wonderful to see each of you in Las Vegas, as well as so many other industry leaders and friends at our events. Just a couple quick questions to round us out of our time. One kind of a curiosity question. In your experiences, what's been the kind of the refund amount spectrum that you all have seen? I'm sure it's all dependent upon how many products were folded into the contract, but what's kind of from a curiosity information standpoint, what have y'all seen as far as the refund amount spectrums? How small are all these processes triggering, and how large of a refund needs to be completed as well? What have y'all seen in that regard?
Yeah, great question, Nick. It certainly does vary. On average, gap refunds are north of 500. Last time I checked, we were trending close to $600 on an average gap refund. Now, it will change dramatically based on states. Different states have different allowances, right? Different amounts that the retailer can charge for gap. However, what's most interesting in that question, Nick, and it's a good one, thank you for asking that, is as loan terms originate at 72 to 84 months. Sometimes we're seeing 96. We even have seen some 120-month auto loan originations coming in the door. Those refunds are going to grow. And so when we say an average gap refund is $500 to $600, you're going to have, if gap is sold in a retail environment at $1,000 on a 72-month loan, you're going to have a $500 liability even at month 36. And what is more staggering about that, not to sound like the Grinch of Christmas past here, Nick, but there is no gap typically after month 36. Yeah, you can get into the 24, 36, 42 months, depending on LTV. But all of a sudden you end up into this consternation where there is no benefit to be rendered from the gap product anymore, but you're still subject to giving a refund. Now, as the regulators and examiners catch up on the mechanics and the actuarial methodologies behind a product like gap, Ann said it best. You got to have different considerations for the sale of that gap product. And whether you're bundling it with an auto deductible reimbursement or other things that we've done to try to, again, make this as consumer friendly as possible, you really got to be cognizant of then suddenly having this unearned fee that needs to be refunded when there is no benefit to be had after a certain point in time in these larger loan originations, Nick.
Interesting. And anything to add, Ann, is on the dollar amount or just the general refund front?
Yeah, I think what is also important, when you look at the number of total losses that we've continued to see increase across the industry, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And I think we'll continue to see it because of parts prices, the lack of availability of rental cars, and quite honestly, the lack of labor in doing vehicle repairs. When you look at a VSC contract and you're looking at average refunds north of $1,000, even up as high as $1,700. So you combine that with a $500 gap because there's no deficiency balance, and you know there's a $1,500 to $2,200 consumer benefit. It doesn't take much error, not to the benefit of the consumer, for those types of dollar amounts to be called out. So I think it's just something to keep in mind as we move forward, that, you know, we're not talking about $20 or $100 or $150. I mean, we're talking about what could be someone's down payment for a new vehicle. So it's really important to keep those dollar amounts in mind.
Incredible indeed. Closing moments here on our webinar, remaining compliant in 2022. Takeaways for enhancing consumer compliance with Ann Holtzman and Peter Krall of Allied Solutions. And displayed there on the screen is our websites at Allied Solutions, where there are more resources available to you to help your shop navigate these challenges. And to round us out, Peter, we'll go back to you, and then Ann will let you have the last word. Whether it was something said from a client or a colleague or at Used Car Week or at some juncture earlier in the year, what's something that someone said to you that's leaving a lasting impression or has really stuck in your mind that you'll definitely be carrying into the new year, whether it was something a client's challenge or an industry anecdote, whatever the case may be. Peter, we'll begin with you, and then Ann to close this out. What's something that's top of mind for you that you're carrying into the new year?
You bet. I think I actually highlighted it earlier when we were talking, and I should credit the quote accordingly, but a great lender once did say to me, "Yeah, Peter, a product refund divided does not mean a product refund is provided." And it really is one of those things where I applauded the lender for coming up with kind of the comprehensiveness, Nick, to carry us into next year, to look at this in total, not just what the letter of the law says, but to simply put, especially in today's world, do the right thing. That's my sentiment for looking ahead, Nick. Thank you.
Excellent. Ann, how about for you?
Yeah, and I'd say, Nick, for me, it's listen, be attentive to the market, because I think we're going to see and hear things that we haven't anticipated, and I think it's a readiness factor. Let's make sure we're ready and we're doing what we can to support our partners as well, and being ready to overcome our business challenges in 2022. I mean, we came out strong from COVID with all the personal and professional setbacks that many of us experience, but our industry is strong, and it's a look forward and be ready for 2022.
That's Ann Holtzman and Peter Kroll from Allied Solutions. And Peter, thank you again for sharing the great information and strategy recommendations through today's webinar. Certainly all the best to each of your families and friends for a wonderful, enjoyable holiday season. Thank you again.
Thank you, Nick, so much.
Thanks, Nick. Happy holidays, Nick. Thank you.
And on behalf of all of us at Cherokee Media Group, I'm Nick Zulovich. We thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having you again next time.